My name is Debbie Reynolds. They call me the Data Diva. Today I want to talk about data privacy, the United Arab Emirates, and their new data protection law. It's called Federal Decree Law 45, 2021 on the protection of personal data. People call it the PPD. So the PPD law will go into effect in January 2022. It also has other guidance and other parts to it. Like, for example, it hasn't yet been determined what sanctions will be, but those things will be rolling out in 2022 as well. And once that final guidance is put into the law, companies will have up to 6 months to comply with the law so that it's be fully enforceable sometime in 2022. So the UAE also created a data privacy office that will be part of this regulation. So it'll basically be in charge of managing privacy for this and possibly other regulations that are in the UAE. The UAE already has sectoral laws that cover privacy or data protection in things like finance, health, credit. They also have free zones in the UAE. So these particular zones have their own data privacy and data protection regulations. So that is the Dubai International Financial Center and the Abu Dhabi Global Market. So this law, it has some similarities with things like the GDPR, where they do have definitions in it about data controllers, data processors. They have a definition of what personal data is, even though it may be possibly a little bit more narrow. There are requirements in it for a legal basis, although not as similar as the GDPR, where, for example, the GDPR has like 6 legal bases and derogations. This particular data protection law has consent. So consent is basically king in this particular data protection law. And then some of the other legal bases that people are accustomed to in the GDPR do not exist in this law. So for companies that are familiar with or align with GDPR, they just have to adjust their way of getting consent or having another way to be able to transfer data if need be to third parties. There are also extraterritorial reach, very similar to the GDPR, meaning that even if a person in the UAE, their data is being transferred outside, there are obligations still for companies in handling their data. They also have, it isn't as strict as the EU in terms of, I guess they have a combination of notice versus consent in these laws. So there isn't like a necessarily opt-in on certain types of data. They do have stipulations here for kind of more sensitive data, very much like the EU. But I think this is a very important law. You know, we saw recently Saudi Arabia also passed their own data protection law, and it's really interesting to see around the world governments being able to pass these regulations about personal data. Like China and even like the US, they exclude some areas of government from their law. So like national security, those things are exceptions to the law. And also, we'll see more, I think, laws like this being passed around the world in Europe, in Asia, and the Middle East as time goes on. Probably one of the more significant changes that people will need to adjust to in this particular law is that the UAE requires a record of processing. So a record of processing, you also have to have that in the GDPR as well. but this record of processing is a lot more detailed. So, for example, in addition to being able to say things like we handle this type of data, from this source, for this date, you also may have to have details about who has access to that data. So it's kind of dipping a toe into cybersecurity as well. And this law also has breach requirements too. So this is really one to watch, one to look at. I think we're going to see a lot more regulations that borrow liberally from a lot of data privacy and data protection regulation around the world. And this is just one of the newer ones. Also, it seems that in Asia and also the Middle East, these laws are being passed a lot more rapidly. So as opposed to laws that we're seeing in the US and the EU, where the laws are passed and there may be like a year or two period for people to adjust to these new laws. These laws are being passed in months. So companies doing business with individuals in the UAE need to pay close attention to this particular law, get their ducks in a row so that they're on board for when this law gets finalized in 2022. That's it. Thank you.